So this is one of Mitchell's paintings called Waiting for a Winter. And we have several of his nocturnes in the museum, but this one is one of my favorites. Oh, let me see. How do I get that? One of his, we like to say Mitchell was an artist, historian, and philosopher, and he wrote a lot of poetry. And this is one of my favorites that he wrote. If I merely break a trail for others who will surpass me, I will be satisfied. And maybe the footprints of the one who showed them the way need not be rubbed out entirely. That's just one of my favorites. So this is Mitchell as a boy. The photograph on the left in Mitchell's handwriting, he wrote on the back, and it says, grab my glasses here. On the back of this picture, Mitchell wrote, Roy Mitchell, when about 12 years old. This was before he had been lied to, double-crossed, or stolen from, and the great big world was just a beautiful place to see and enjoy. You'll see throughout this that Mitchell had quite the personality. So there were two things that Mitchell was interested in when he was a boy, and that was horses and drawing. And if he wasn't on a horse or working with a horse, he was sketching. If he ran out of paper, he would take a rock and sketch on the wooden sidewalks in Trinidad. This is he and his sister Tot. Tot was his closest friend, confidant. They had another sister, Harriet, and he called her Hat. Tot's name is Ethel Erickson. It was her ranch where all of his New York and New Jersey friends would come and spend the summers and hang out, ride around in Mitchell's Model A with their paints and bedrolls in the back and just see the country and paint. Mitchell started out in cartoons. This was one of his earliest cartoons that we have. This is from a Christmas edition of the Chronicle News in 1910, and it's called The Empty Stocking. One of the things that I always felt a kinship with Mitchell about was when I first moved to Trinidad, I came here to run the newspaper, and he worked at the newspaper for several years. He started when he was about 17, and in 1913 left for, he said he was bored. He wasn't doing anything with his life in Trinidad. So he left and went to the Pacific Northwest. He worked in advertising, and he did cartoons and was an artist in the advertising department. Both of his parents died in 1912. His two sisters moved in with their aunt, his mother's sister, and he felt like he could go then. So in 1913, he left Trinidad. In 1917, went into the U.S. Army as a drill sergeant. He was very disappointed that he wasn't accepted into the cavalry because he was a cowboy and knew how to ride a horse, but the U.S. Army said it's easier to train somebody that's never been on a horse than retrain a cowboy to ride like they wanted him to. So he was a drill sergeant. He was accepted into officer candidate school, but the war ended, and he went back to Seattle and worked at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, but was very dissatisfied. He didn't like the weather. He wasn't crazy about the people. And he heard that Harvey Dunn was teaching a class at the Grand Central Art School, and also heard that Harold von Schmidt was going to be attending that class. So he sold everything, got on the train, and took off for New York. When he got to New York, he got off the train, he penned a letter to his sister Tot right away and said, "This is the biggest hay barn I've ever seen." But he really liked his time there. He jokingly said that he would never put New York or New Jersey license plates on his car, on whatever car he was driving, because his friends would run him out of Colorado if he ever drove back into the state with those license plates. But here's another one of his not necessarily a poem, but he kept a sketch pad, a small notepad with him all the time. He would doodle, he would just write down his thoughts, what he saw. He was a very keen observer. And I love going down in our archives and just picking up one of his notepads and seeing what goodness I'll find. And this was one of them. So this is Mitchell and his sister Tot, just kind of hanging out at her ranch. It was an adobe building that he designed and oversaw the building of it. So here we go with Mitchell and Dunn. These are two portraits done, Dunn on the left, Mitchell on the right, done by Paul Milosevic. So Mitchell was a student of Dunn's. Paul Milosevic was a student of Mitchell's, and he went on to be a very well-known portrait artist. He's still alive today and lives in Santa Fe. He's close to 90 now, but we have both of these hanging in our museum. This is a song that Mitchell wrote. The slide is not showing all of it, but I can send it to you if you'd like. This song was, it's about Harvey, and this song was sung at the June 1941 student picnic. They had a picnic every year, and this just shows how well Mitchell knew Dunn and how much he thought about him. This is a picture of one of Dunn's classrooms, and this, I believe, is 1926. And it was very groundbreaking that it was a mixed class. Well, actually, this is a segregated class. It's just one proctor in there with these women, but that they were painting from a live male model. And this is Harvey Dunn and another one of his classrooms. This one was in Leahy, New Jersey, not in Grand Central Station. This is one of those picnics. Just laying around having fun, and Dunn is there in the background. I think this is the same group of hooligans that were in that picnic. It's Mitchell on the bottom right. Dunn in his studio in Leonia. Tot's house. So these are the bottom two are photographs that Mitchell took at Tot's house, and the top two are sketches that Dunn did. One of the outside of her house and one of the living room where they would all hang out. If those walls could talk. This house was just torn down about a year ago. It had dilapidated. It's now owned by the Bar and I Ranch in Stonewall. But these are just some of the fun sketches that we have. This is a letter from Harvey Dunn's son, and it's talking about the trip that he went on with his dad when he was young to Todd's ranch, and just talks about the memories that he still has to this day about riding out in the old Model A and watching his father painting. And so most of Mitchell's friends, Harold Von Schmidt, Dunn, Grant Renard, Frank Street, loved Mitchell's sister Tot, and they all corresponded with her regularly. And in most of the correspondences with Mitchell, they always included "say hello to Tot." And she was a fixture in the art world from rural Stonewall, Colorado. This is Dunn and Tot at her ranch. And this was, I believe, was the picture that Robert was talking about in his letter, thanking Mitchell for sending his mother this picture. This was taken in 1937. And here's another one of them up on Levita Pass. I believe it was the same day, same outfits. And here's Tot and Miss, and Harvey's wife is always referred to in the letters as Mrs. Harvey Dunn. I don't know if it was a joke or if that's what they really called her. Mitchell mentions her by name several times in letters, but when it's written on a picture or the envelope addressed to her, it says Mrs. Harvey Dunn. This is that car that he kept in Colorado. I don't think he would have driven this all the way from New York to Colorado, but Mitchell was quite an adventurer, so he could have. But you can see his saddle in the back, and we still have, so Mitchell kept everything. He was a bit of a hoarder and or collector. And we have hundreds of paintbrushes, plein air boxes, tubes of paint, packets of tobacco. We even have his insurance card and driver's license. These are some of the plein air paintings that Dunn did while hanging out with Mitchell in Colorado. That's the Stonewall that goes through Colorado to the Continental Divide. The road goes right through the middle of that stone wall, and the little town is called Stonewall. And here is Caroline and Bill and I had talked earlier in the last week about how Dunn wasn't a huge fan of plein air painting, but here's a great photograph that Mitchell kept of him pretty young in that picture. It wasn't a photograph that Mitchell took, but this was in our file. So I just thought it would be fun to include that in there. This is a portrait of Tot that Dunn did for Mitchell. He did a couple of them. And this one is hanging in the museum now. These are some of the Dunn paintings that we have in our collection. Mitchell did not like to sell his work, but he would trade with other artists. We've got about 30 Dunns altogether in several sketches. But this is one that's hanging right now. We have an exhibit up that is kind of student teacher. It's Dunn, Mitchell, and Von Schmidt. And you can see some of the similarities. I've thrown in one of Mitchell's into this series also. This one just gets me. Every time I look at it, I see something different. For a while, I didn't see the man that this woman is mourning over. It took me a while to see it, but just the heartache in that picture gets me every time, just every time. This is one that I always love. This one is not hanging currently, but it is in our collection. This one, I'm sure you've seen several like this. This is one of my favorites just because it's personalized. To me, this looks like one that he could have done down here in Colorado, but I love the little caricature at the bottom. To me, it doesn't look like any picture I've seen of Harvey Dunn, but I just love that one. This is a saddle that Dunn gave Mitchell. They kind of scratched underneath the seat of the saddle. It looks like Harvey Dunn got it in 1914, and then he gave it to Mitchell in 1931. But we've got about 17 saddles that belong to Mitchell on exhibit in the museum, but this one's special because it came from Dunn. And Mitchell used this saddle in a painting, in an illustration called the Vaquero. I did not include a picture of that one though. So this is also Dunn. And I believe the next one is Mitchell. So you can see, I'll just toggle back and forth real quick. You can see the similarities in student and teacher. But this one is hanging in that area of the museum right now. This is another letter. I just found this one interesting from that Bob had found some charcoal sketches from 1918, and he didn't know why his dad didn't send them to the Smithsonian, and that he was sure there was a really good reason why his dad didn't, but he did. He went ahead and sent them to the Smithsonian. But if you can imagine the treasures that he found, but this was after his father had passed away that he found these. These are some of Mitchell's illustrations. He became an illustrator while in art school under Harvey Dunn's tutelage, and in 1944 he moved back to Trinidad. Hang on just a second. And hang on, I'll be right back, just one second. Sorry about that. The painter just showed up. In 1944, Mitchell was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he came back to Trinidad to spend his last bit of time with his sister and ended up living another 34 years. So in 1944 is when he stopped doing illustrations, but these are some of his magazine covers that he did while living in New Jersey. The one on the far left, the two J's, the double J was a local ranch here in our area. It's called Up the River, up Highway 12. Everybody in Mitchell's paintings were people, in his illustrations, were people that he knew. And I think they all enjoyed seeing who was going to be on the cover of the next pulp. So Mitchell, when he moved back to Trinidad, he was asked by the president of Trinidad State Junior College if he would put together an art class at TSJC. And so Mitchell founded the art program at Trinidad State Junior College. And this is a quote from Mitchell on the bottom of this slide. It says, when I was a kid around this town, everybody was either a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, or went to work at CF&I. That's the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. None of these things appealed to me. I thought I wanted to do something else. There was no one around in those days to encourage a person to make pictures. In fact, they did everything they could to discourage you. There's no one around to talk to. Maybe that's the main reason I decided to teach. So someone interested in making pictures would have someone to talk to. Now, he was not a sweetheart of a guy. He was very rough on his students. He kind of told it like it was. And there's one student named Mavis that said, how am I doing? And he said, well, you're consistent. You're consistently bad, but you're consistent. So he did not hold back on criticisms or critiques. But here's a few more of his illustrations. The one on the right is called 4th of July. That's one of my favorites. Now, when he put a woman in his paintings, there's a redhead and there's a brunette. There were two significant women that he dated in his life, and it's either one of those two women. The dark-haired woman was a opera singer in New York, and they were together for about 10 years, and it was either his career or her career. Neither one of them were willing to give one up for the other, so they went their separate ways. And Mitchell said the best thing he ever did for that woman was not marry her. This is called Trail Scout, and this is one of his fine art pieces that he did once he came back to Trinidad and stopped doing the illustrations. This one's called Trailhead. And there are many days that I walk outside and look up at the sky and I say, oh, those are Mitchell clouds today. This is called The Prayer. And what Mitchell said about this painting, Mitchell didn't, he would say, I don't paint Indians. That was just, he respected Native American culture. He did not want to exploit the Native Americans. And so he was very, very cautious about, he sketched a lot of Native Americans. He hung out in the Taos Pueblo. We have an extensive collection of Mitchell's Native American textiles, pottery, turquoise and silver jewelry, but he just didn't, if he painted Native Americans, it was for himself. It was not, he wouldn't have sold it or put it on a magazine cover. What he said about this particular painting was, what I have been seeking for here is a rare quality than just the outer and picturesque phases of the Indian. I have attempted to render some of the mystery, the grandeur of the primitive soul, some of the mystical relation with the outer world, that strange closeness to the soil, as much a part of the landscape as the mesa or the mountain. I would like to show him as an austere and grandiose example of the great and primitive people. But this one is called The Prayer. And he used Russell, C.M. Russell, for reference in the feathers, the headdress, the shape of the head. I found some sketches of Mitchell's and I thought, wow, that doesn't look exactly like Mitchell's sketches. And then in the bottom corner, it says traced from C.M. Russell. This is not my work. Mm-hmm. And so I was on the board at the museum for 4 years before I took the job as the director. And I thought I knew a little bit about Mitchell. And I thought he would be rolling in his grave if he knew that there was an entire museum dedicated to him, because he did not self-promote. He didn't care if you liked his work or not. He just did what he wanted to do. And as I get into the archives in the basement and reading his letters and looking at his sketches, I'm thinking he left all of this because he knew somebody was going to do something with it, or he wouldn't have left those little gems, those little notes about, this is not me, this is somebody else's work. So this is another one of his poems that I love. Because the museum sits on Main Street in Trinidad, Main Street is also, Trinidad has two branches of the Santa Fe Trail, and Main Street is the old Santa Fe Trail. So I can go outside of the museum and sit on the bench and think about this poem and all the different people that went right by that exact spot. But I'll just read this to you quickly. I love to sit of a summer's eve by the street in this old town and watch the ghost of pioneers go riding up and down. When the last red rays of sunset have faded in the sky, I sit alone in the twilight hush and watch the ghost go by. So Mitchell, after he finished teaching, he was just walking down Main Street one day. He ate lunch at the same Benjamin Franklin Cafe every day. He went over to the post office and came out of the post office, and across the street from the post office is the Baca House and the Bloom Mansion. The Baca House was the first home built on Main Street in Trinidad, and it's an adobe home. The Bacas and the Blooms founded Trinidad. We saw a for sale sign in front of the Baca House, and he kind of moved in. He just squatted in the Baca House until he raised enough money to purchase it and turned it into a museum. Later on, they added the Bloom Mansion to the museum, the Pioneer Museum in the back of it. Mitchell lived there until 2 years before his death. He became the curator of the Trinidad History Museum, which is now part of History Colorado. Now part of History Colorado in Trinidad. One of the reasons Mitchell didn't sell his work is he had other jobs. He had his job as an illustrator. He had his job as a teacher at the college and as a curator at the History Museum. Lucky for us, he didn't like to sell them. We've got about 250 original paintings, about 5,000 sketches, then his sketchbooks, then all of the letters that we have that were written to Mitchell that he kept, all of the magazine covers. He would just rip off the cover and toss it in a box. To me, he was planning for what he was leaving for all of us to enjoy. He loved history. He loved his friends. He loved writing letters. He loved keeping in touch with everybody. He loved giving you his opinion, whether you wanted it or not. And he loved spending the summers with his sister, with all of his friends around down here in Trinidad. I don't have much. He and Dunn traveled a lot together. The letters, they would check in with each other almost weekly, and it may just be a short note. This is where I'm going this week. Where are you going? We'll meet up in North Carolina. We'll meet up at an art show in New York. And I think they were as close as two people could be, loved each other's family and loved each other like brothers. And the connection for us is just so important, because Mitchell, if Dunn hadn't been teaching that class, Mitchell, we don't know what would have become of him if he would have just stayed doing cartoons, but Dunn was just so instrumental in pivoting Mitchell's life to the path that made him unbelievably happy to be able to be paid to paint what he knew. What drew him to Dunn and Von Schmidt was that they were both cowboys. He saw how they tied knots and thought, we can be friends. They know what they're doing. They're not just painting Hollywood's version of a cowboy. It was the real thing. And I guess the rest is history with these two. Any questions?
Yeah, feel free to unmute, or you can put questions in the chat.
I just want to thank you for the beautiful poetry. I just feel like that was just a great addition to your presentation this morning. And that, along with the letters, I think kind of shows us the history of letters and keeping these things. And I think I think we all need to tell our own stories. And I think that empowers us to remember the importance of the written word. So thank you for incorporating that into the story.
You're welcome. That was a big part of Mitchell's charm, was his letter writing.
I can tell that. Thank you.
A question from Monica. I wouldn't be surprised if Mitchell went to South Dakota with Dunn. And in fact, I'd be surprised if he didn't, but I don't have anything referencing it, or I haven't come across it yet. I haven't read every letter. Dunn's handwriting is a little hard for me to read, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if he went to South Dakota.
I wanted to ask a question. You mentioned that when Mitchell was growing up, there was no art school. Was he just self-taught then?
He was self-taught until he did take some correspondence courses when he was in Washington. He finished his formal education in Trinidad, and that just went to 8th grade. So his formal education ended at 8th grade. His first 2 jobs were with cattle companies doing the roundups. He was offered a 3rd season at the cattle company, but started working at the newspapers in instead. And he didn't take a real art class until 1925 when he went to New York City and met Harvey Dunn.
Wow. Impressive. So these Western pulp magazines, do you have any of those intact in the museum then, or just these covers? Oh,
We do.
okay.
Anytime, sometimes I'll go online and just search and see what I can find online, on eBay, on different Western pulp sites. Some people find them and donate them to the museum. Just, look what I found at a garage sale or at a auction or whatever. And so we do have quite a few. Mitchell just didn't keep the whole magazine. He only kept the top cover.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a brochure with the Dunn paintings. We're working on that. We have almost all of them in digitized in a high resolution digital format. We're working on doing that to our whole collection, but I don't have a brochure just with Harvey Dunn's paintings. Right now we have 9 on exhibit in the museum right now.
Did you say his sister Tot was an artist as well?
No, she wasn't an artist, but she was a collector. In our museum, we have an exhibit called the Sacred Art Exhibit, and that's Tot's contribution to the museum, as well as, so Mitchell never married and he didn't have children. Tot married, but she didn't have children. So Mitchell left everything to Tot, and Tot donated the collection to start the museum. And her collection is Spanish colonial and New Mexican religious artifacts. And we have that on display in the museum as well. In fact, our next, right now we have an artist, Cody Kell out of Longmont. He's exhibiting on our second floor right now. And when that comes down the middle of February, our next exhibit will be a contemporary Santero exhibit that goes along with Tot's collection.
Allyson, thank you so much for doing this for us today. It's nice to kind of meet you and to learn more about Mitchell and Dunn. So I think I speak for everybody when I just say thank you so much for being here.
It is absolutely my pleasure. And if any of you ever get down to Trinidad, just give me a little ring, give me a heads up, and we'll go down in the basement and you can see all the Dunns that we have. This is I was showing Carolyn at the beginning, this is my Dunn binder. You can see how thick it is. There's a lot. I actually had a really good time doing this presentation, just figuring out which pieces that I was going to share, but there's so many that I didn't get to share.
Now, did he copy any of his letters? I mean, you do have these little poems and so on, but letters that he sent to other people, did he make copies?
We do have a binder of letters that Mitchell sent. There were a few that he carbon copied, but most of the letters that we have that Mitchell sent to other people were sent to us, were like given back to us. He kept some important ones that he wrote to city officials or the governor or politicians or what have you. But most of his personal correspondence, he did not keep a copy of. He kept everything that was sent to him, but not what he sent out.
Because I was, that Taylor brought back some copies of Dunn's letters to Arthur, but it'd be interesting. It's too bad we only see that one side and not see the Mitchell letters. Who knows whatever happened to those. That's why I asked the question, and because the Dunn letters to Mitch were so personal and really, really interesting. And
There are so
you just want to hear Mitch.
right.
You know?
There's so many letters that I come across, like referencing a specific party or a specific argument that they had at a party. And I'm like, oh, I just want to know the other side of it. It just, of course, my imagination, I just make up a story on what must have happened. But I would love to see the other side of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was just asked that by Sue, does your art museum have any Mitchells? To my knowledge, y'all don't have any. There's one hanging at the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. There's one hanging in the Denver Public Library. But other than that, I think we've got about 90% of the existing Mitchell paintings in the museum. We have curated a traveling exhibit that it hasn't gone anywhere yet. We've just finished that. I would love to see that hanging in your museum for a little bit and do something about the connection between the two. I think that would be lovely. From my understanding, Mitchell kept everything and Dunn didn't keep hardly anything. So, but I think we've got enough to establish that story between the two of them.
I think that's something we can talk about for the future, Allyson, for sure.
Well, are there any other questions?
So Allyson, and did you catch that the Murdo connection in the
I did. I just saw that. Now I know. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Allyson. We really appreciate you spending your time putting this together and your time today presenting it.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. I learned something new every time I go down into the archives.
And I encourage people, if they're traveling that way, definitely to stop in Trinidad and see the museum. The building itself is really quite impressive. And so again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.